about to begin the proceedings. My name is Senator Nigel Lefreitas, Vice President of the Senate of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And at this time, I would invite you to stand as we play the national anthem of Trinidad and Tobago, sung by the Parliament Choir. Good morning. You may be seated. At this time, I do invite a representative to bring to us the safety briefings for this morning's proceedings and this afternoon's session.
Please pay attention to the following announcement, as in the event of an emergency, it will determine the effectiveness of your response. Welcome to Hyatt Regency, Trinidad. The following is a brief description of the hotel's evacuation guidelines. Should it become necessary to evacuate the hotel, you will be notified by a continuous siren, followed by an audible instruction to evacuate the building. Upon hearing the "May I have your attention, please" over the intercom, you should proceed orderly to the exit closest to you and make your way to the muster point to the car park located on Dock Road. An emergency response officer from Hyatt will assist you in evacuating. Once outside, conduct a head count for your group to be sure that no one is left inside. Should you believe someone is missing, notify the security officer stationed in your area. Do not go back into the building for any reason until the fire service has given the all clear. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and do enjoy your time at the Hyatt.
A brief announcement before I invite the first speaker to bring opening remarks. The headsets in front of you are multi-language headsets, and for those whose first language is not English, you can put them on now, and channel 1 is English, channel 2 is Spanish, and channel 3 is French. So you can put them on so that you are able to understand the speakers that will be speaking today. And at this point in time, to bring opening remarks, I do invite to the podium The host of the gathering today and the member of the Board of Directors of ParlAmericas, the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Bridget Anisette George, MP.
Senator, the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, President of the Senate of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. The Honorable Camille Robinson-Regis, MP, Minister of Planning and Development. The Honorable Ayanna Webster Roy, MP, Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister. The Honorable Robert Noult, Vice President of ParlAmericas. Senator, the Honorable Mubida Jaffer, Vice Chairman of the Parliamentary Network of Gender Equality. Ms. Bridget Burns, Co-Director, Women's Environment and Development Network, and our feature speaker. Other government ministers and members of Parliament of the various jurisdictions. And I recognize Senator the Honorable Chester A.A. Humphrey, President of the Senate of the Parliament of Grenada, and Senator the Honorable Janine Michelle McIntyre, President of the Senate of the Parliament of St. Lucia. Senator the Honorable Carla Barnett, Vice President of the Senate and Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance of Belize. Members of the Diplomatic Corps and international organizations. Dr. Denise Sawyer Fat Angus, Presiding Officer of the Tobago House of Assembly, secretaries and assemblymen of the Tobago House of Assembly, mayors and representatives of the municipal corporations of Trinidad and Tobago, senior government officials, representatives of non-governmental and civil society organizations, representatives of ParlAmericas, specialist observers and assistants, members of the media, the Executive Director of ParlAmericas and the staff of ParlAmericas, the Clerk of the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago, and the staff of the Office of the Parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And I wish to crave your indulgence before I start to really commend the Parliament's choir. And I know some of us weren't too sure whether we applaud the national anthem. And I just want to say to the choir, I think we didn't applaud because we weren't sure it was appropriate, but we certainly appreciated your rendition of the national anthem. And I think the fact that the rendition was done by the Parliament's choir also is a great starting point for us, in that it supports the view that the answers usually lie within. The inauguration of this 10th gathering of the ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality, themed Gender Responsive Climate Action, heralds 2 days of dedicated and targeted work by the legislators of ParlAmericas on gender-responsive approaches to climate change. Our theme is easily located in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 13 and Goal 5 respectively, which hearken us to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, and to achieve gender equality. This easy identification of our business over the next couple of days with the Sustainable Development Goals is in itself justification for a gathering of parliamentarians, because the Agenda 2030 Declaration mandates that there is an essential role of national parliaments through their enactment of legislation and adoption of budgets, and their role in ensuring accountability for the effective implementation of our country's commitments. In the collaborative publication by the United Nations Development Programme, the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, and the Islamic Development Bank, entitled Parliament's Role in Implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, a Parliamentary Handbook Space, legislators are reminded almost sternly as follows, and I quote, "Members of Parliament are uniquely positioned to act as an interface between the people and state institutions, and to promote and adopt people-centered policies and legislation to ensure that no one is left behind," end of quote. But without intending in any way to diminish the importance of Agenda 2030, I wish to surmise that this gathering has a justification of its own. While all 35 member countries of ParlAmericas are members of the Organization of the American States, which is a voluntary organization, there exists among us an involuntary connection. That connection reveals a very telling story, one of which underscores the imperative of this gathering. All of the members are in the Western Hemisphere. 21 of our countries are bounded by the Caribbean Sea. 20 of our countries have an Atlantic coastline. 21 of the 35 are situated on the same continent. And I must quickly interject here that if my numbers are incorrect, blame it on my mathematics and not on my geography. Through the incidence of geography, our countries are inextricably linked in the context of climate, and I dare postulate that a cursory glance of our collective experiences for the year 2017 alone supports this. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would prefer to shy away from the memories of the horrific devastation which in many of our member countries sustained and the catastrophic losses which our citizens suffered during last year's hurricane season. But in doing so, I may run the risk of being cast in the mold of the ostrich hiding its head in the sand. Highlights of the climatic occurrences in 2017 will demonstrate hurricanes came in rapid succession. The names of Brett, Gert, Franklin, Harvey, Irma, and Maria will not be lost on anyone this morning. Prior to 2017, a roll call of those names may have prompted some of us to muse over memorable encounters with friends of such names. But now, that very roll call conjures up painful images of destruction, devastation, loss, and human suffering throughout the beautiful pearls of the Caribbean island chain. In Central America, the painful mosaic was no different. On September 7th, 2017, a magnitude 8.2 earthquake struck off the southern coast of Mexico. It was one of the strongest earthquakes in the country's history and the most powerful globally in 2017. 12 days later, on 19 September, another earthquake struck with a magnitude of 7.1. At least 44 buildings collapsed. 370 people were killed. In South America, severe floods and landslides occurred in the northwestern coast of South America. In Peru, a climate phenomenon known as El Niño Costero led to torrential rains in the first quarter of last year and to the overflowing of numerous rivers, resulting in major flooding. On the 1st of April 2017, unusually heavy rain in the area around the city of Mocoa in Colombia, situated in the Andes, caused several rivers to overflow, resulting in flash flooding and landslides. For our hemisphere, and particularly for the Caribbean and Latin American members, the timing of this gathering could not be more appropriate. According to an article entitled Natural Disasters in Latin America, a look back at 2017, and I quote, "Some experts are projecting an increase in the frequency of extreme storms, category 4 and 5, in most areas due to continued climate change. In a study published in November 2017, a team of researchers analyzed the coastal communities in Latin America and the Caribbean are at risk of being affected by natural disasters." But hold up, ladies and gentlemen, please don't fall into despair. On the positive side, one conclusion which cannot be denied is that our constituent countries of ParlAmericas have tremendous experience with treating with natural disasters. And this gathering presents us with the opportunity to rethink the how with which we must treat the effects of climate change. As a result of our work in ParlAmericas, and in particular the platform of gender equality, our collective understanding of the varied but equally important roles and responsibilities of men and women in our society has increased considerably. Our learnings have instructed us that the engagement and leadership of both men and women equally are needed to make our response to climate change fully effective. One size doesn't fit all, so that gender neutrality, even if there is in reality such a thing, in the context of climate change and sustainable development will not only be inappropriate, but is and shall be ineffective, inefficient, and result in a wastage of resources. And of course, shall leave, if not half, but very large segments of our populations behind. We as legislators have long recognized that gender is a cross-cutting theme, and therefore it is incumbent upon us in the discharge of our responsibilities to fashion accordingly our policies of mitigation and risk reduction, preparation, response and rehabilitation, and resilience and adaptation. While no one of us can claim to have it right, we appreciate that there are learnings to be had from our individual experiences. The constraints of time have required that we be selective in our considerations over these next couple of days. But I feel assured that the topics on our agenda, which include centering women in climate change adaptation, gender, health, and climate change, shall be engaging and beneficial to us all. To the non-legislators among us, in addition to having invited you to this opening, we have extended an invitation to join us in session 1, entitled Approaching Climate Risk from a Gender Perspective. This is an opportunity to see your legislators at work in a different environment, not the hurly-burly of the plenary, not the cut and thrust of the probing examination at the Joint Select Committee, but in an interactive, cooperative environment of information gathering and information sharing. We offer you this as an opportunity to learn with us and also to inform us. And I hope that you shall accept our invitation to share with us this morning. In closing, I wish each of us all the success in our exchanges over the next few days. I thank you.
Once again, Madam Speaker, I wish to thank you for those opening remarks, which I am certain will resonate in the minds of all who are listening here this morning as we traverse the topics and engage in robust discussions on the scheduled sessions today. Thank you again. I now invite to the podium the Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to bring further remarks, the Honorable Ayanna Webster Roy, MP.
Senator, the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, President of the Senate of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Bridget Anisette George, MP, Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Camille Robinson Regis, MP, Minister of Planning and Development, government ministers and members of Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Robert Note, Vice President of ParlAmericas, Ms. Bridget Burns, Coordinator, Women's Environment and Development Network and feature speaker, members of the Diplomatic Corps and international organizations, participants and NGO representatives, representatives of ParlAmericas, specialists, observers and assistants, members of the media, staff of ParlAmericas and the Office of the Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my pleasure to address you here today at the 10th gathering of the ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality. This gathering is of great importance as it represents our coming together as parliamentarians to discuss ways in which we can tackle issues affecting our global community, particularly issues around the impact of gender inequality. Colleagues, this gathering is significant. Climate change is affecting our families, our communities, and our countries. As such, it is imperative that we, as parliamentarians, acknowledge that gender equality is crucial to tackling climate change and discuss our role and influence in ensuring gender equality. Within recent times, we have seen the impact of global warming and climate change within our region and worldwide. This situation, caused by human action and inaction, adversely affects human life and civilization as a whole. Colleagues, according to Trinidad and Tobago's 5th National Report to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in October 2016, climate change is expected to drive further reductions in the diversity and extent of Trinidad and Tobago's natural ecosystems. The increase in sea surface temperatures will negatively impact our coral reefs in Tobago and change the terrestrial plant populations because of shifting rainfall and temperature patterns. This situation is not unique to my twin island state. It is a shared experience throughout the Caribbean. Colleagues, Trinidad and Tobago, like other Caribbean countries, has been subject to increases in invasive species, as we saw in the case of 2012 with the lionfish, which has the potential to negatively impact the marine fisheries and the dive tourism industry. A 2013 UN ECLAC report on assessment of the economic and social impacts of climate change on the coastal and marine sectors in the Caribbean revealed that the region is already being impacted by sea level rise and potential vulnerabilities for coastal zones. The report noted these vulnerabilities to include increased shoreline erosion leading to alteration of the coastline, loss of coastal wetlands, and changes in the profile of the fish and other marine life populations. Right here in Trinidad, we saw recently massive coastal landslips in the south, where families lost their homes and had to be relocated. Climate change affects every facet of life and cuts across all sectors. In the agriculture sector, for example, we have witnessed changes in the average temperatures rainfall, pests and diseases, and other factors which in turn reduces the nutritional quality of some foods. Recently in Trinidad and Tobago, our population experienced noticeable changes in our dry and rainy seasons, which impacted our agricultural production and food supply. Colleagues, the influences of weather and climate on human health are also significant and varied. Exposure to health hazards related to climate change affects the different people and different communities to different degrees. While often assessed individually, exposure to multiple climate change threats can occur simultaneously, resulting in compounding or cascading health impacts. Climate change affects the survival, distribution, and behavior of mosquitoes, ticks, and rodents that carry diseases like Lyme disease. In addition, the effects of global climate change on mental health and well-being are integral parts of the overall climate-related human health impact. Gender, health, and climate change is one that requires analysis and a systematic approach if we are to effectively and efficiently promote change within the Americas and the Caribbean. Colleagues, while climate change has affected and continues to affect all people across the world, certain groups are more vulnerable and experience more severe consequences than others. For example, we know that poorer communities are more likely to be affected by climate change than higher income communities, particularly due to their limited access to information and financial resources, as well as their increased dependence on natural resources. We also know from research that gender plays a critical role in individual vulnerability, with women being negatively affected to a larger extent by the impacts of climate change. Women, by far, form a larger percentage of the world's poor, having limited access to power and resources compared to men. Women, men, girls, and boys are therefore differently affected by and find different ways of coping with and adapting to disaster and climate impacts. Incorporating gender perspectives in addressing climate may be seen as further complicating an already multi-layered and complex issue. However, using a gendered approach to climate change is crucial if we are to effectively address the issue with equity. Gender-sensitive approaches to climate change provides opportunities to treat with gender inequalities. It seeks to treat equitability in planning for climate change, implementing solutions to address change, and most importantly, addressing the impact of such changes. For example, the needs of a single-parent household in the Caribbean must be addressed in disasters. Most of these homes are headed by females and are usually low-income households. In our quest to ensure gender equality and gender-responsive climate change, I thank you, and may God continue to bless us all.
Members, I wish to second that motion of the Honourable Minister Ayanna Webster Roy for you to enjoy Trinidad and Tobago whilst you're here. I wish to thank the Minister in the office, Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister, for those opening remarks that she has brought here today. And she is the Minister with responsibility for gender issues, and as she has stated, has been championing those issues in Trinidad and Tobago. I think we should give her another round of applause for the great work that she's been doing in the Office of the Prime Minister. I now invite to the podium to say a few words the Minister of Planning and Development of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honourable Camille Robinson-Regis, MP.
Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, President of the Senate of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. The Honorable Bridget Anisette George, Speaker of the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago. The Honorable Ayanna Webster Roy, Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister. The Honorable Robert Nault, Vice President of ParlAmericas. Senator the Honorable Mobida Jaffa, Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Network on Gender Equality. Ms. Bridget Burns, Co-Director, Women's Environment and Development Network, and our feature speaker. Other government ministers and members of Parliament of the various jurisdictions here. And I take the opportunity to recognize Senator the Honorable Chester A.A. Humphrey, President of the Senate of the Parliament of Grenada. Senator the Honorable Janine Michelle Girodi McIntyre, President of the Senate of the Parliament of St. Lucia. Senator the Honorable Carla Barnett, Vice President of the Senate and Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance of Belize. Members of the Diplomatic Corps and international organizations. Dr. Denise Soyafat Angus, Presiding Officer of the Tobago House of Assembly, Secretaries and Assemblymen of the THA, Mayors and Chairmen and representatives of the municipal corporations, senior government officials, representatives of non-governmental and civil society organizations, members of the Cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago, members of the Senate and House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago, representatives of ParlAmericas, specialist observers and assistants, members of the media, Executive Director of ParlAmericas and staff, Clerk of the House, Clerk of the Senate, and staff of the Office of the Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, bonjour, buenos dias, good morning. And after that speech by my colleague, Ayanna Webster Roy, one of my cabinet colleagues told me to just go and say, I beg to move. But I will say just a little more than that. And for me, it is always a pleasure when we can take some time off from the hustle and bustle of our local parliamentary agendas to gather for discussions that impact not only on our local constituencies, but which affect the wider global village we inhabit. Such is the interdependent nature of our existence that the freezing over of the Niagara Falls is of equal importance to us here in the Caribbean, as is the devastation caused by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, to our colleagues to the south, and the current eruption of Hawaii's Mount Kilauea. It is an interdependence born out of the simple fact that we are all connected, that Brother Moon, Sister Sun, and our 5 oceans all contribute to making us who we are. There is no disputing the fact that those of us who reside on small island developing states might be more significantly impacted than those with wider swathes of land to absorb the impact. But ladies and gentlemen, sisters in the cause in particular, climate change and its effects are highly variable around the world. Most countries will experience climate change that works to their disadvantage, with temperature increases, longer droughts, and increasingly frequent and violent hurricanes, exacerbating stresses that already challenge their economic systems. I am comforted, though, by the simple fact that our agenda over the next few days speaks specifically to gender-responsive climate action. For if anyone can make a difference in the way in which policies are crafted, it must be the female politicians in our midst. Irrespective of which side of the gender divide we locate ourselves, our conversations with respect to climate change must be grounded in the reality of our own politics and the present state of our national economies. As a cabinet minister charged with the responsibility of managing Trinidad and Tobago's response to the climate change conundrum, I am painfully aware that when you put climate change in the economic and political context, it becomes more complicated and difficult to arrive at consensus. Trinidad and Tobago is moving rapidly ahead with its own climate change agenda and has, as one of the 5 pillars of our own National Strategic Development Plan, our Vision 2030, an articulated desire to placing the environment at the center of social and economic development. To this end, we have made significant strides in a number of areas. These include the following: the appointment of an interministerial committee to oversee the implementation of an integrated coastal zone management policy framework, strategy, and action plan, the establishment of the Institute of Marine Affairs as the regional activity center of the Caribbean Environmental Program. The Environmental Management Agency is currently reviewing the National Environmental Policy to improve strategies for waste management, as well as reviewing the water pollution rules, developing ambient water quality standards, and re-examining as well the beverage container rules. We have also seen the 10% reduction in the country's hydrofluorocarbon baseline since 2015. The Ministry of Planning and Development has only recently designated the Tobago Main Ridge Forest Reserve, which has been designated a national forest reserve since 1776. We have recently designated it an environmentally sensitive area, and this area is home to the ocellated gecko, an animal not found anywhere else in the world, and it has already been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Additionally, on the EMA's advice as well, we have also designated the scarlet ibis, one of our national birds, as an environmentally sensitive species, thus affording it even greater protection under the law. Trinidad and Tobago is also well on the way to achieving a significant reduction in its carbon footprint, particularly in terms of public transport, through the recent commissioning of 35 new buses that will be powered by compressed natural gas. The government has also provided significant concessions to individuals and corporations either wishing to or actually converting their vehicles from gasoline to CNG or to purchase new CNG vehicles. Madam President of the Senate, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I have noted the topics scheduled to be discussed over the course of this gathering, and as politicians, I am certain that we will have a very spirited debate of points and counterpoints. Allow me to suggest, therefore, that we attempt to discover the connections between climate change and our political and economic systems, and in the course of our discussions, particularly from a gender-based perspective, determine what are real and workable solutions. I believe that this gathering is poised to deal more effectively with the urgent crisis of climate change that looms over all of us, in a way that at first blush may seem harder, but in the final analysis will prove easier if we use it as a mechanism to strengthen our democracies and its institutions and revive our collective sense of citizenship in Trinidad and Tobago and in all the countries that we represent here. In my estimation, there is no need for a fight between science and politics. Indeed, the discussion must be between citizenship and the market, between public goods and private goods, what we must do to strengthen our democracies and protect our environments, and whether the decisions we make as politicians have a significant positive impact on our respective countries. Then I believe we can and we will meet the challenges brought on by climate change. I believe all of us gathered here this morning have two things in common. We are politicians and we are also ordinary citizens as well, working together for the common good of our people. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the courtesy of your attention and wish all of us a very productive gathering. May God bless us and the people of the countries that we represent.
Thank you again, Minister of Planning and Development, the Honorable Camille Robinson-Regis, for those insightful remarks, informative as well, in relation to all of the activities taking place institutionally in Trinidad and Tobago in relation to climate change. I can definitely say that all members present today will benefit from the topic at hand as we seek to link gender with climate change. At this point in time, I invite at this point in time, I just want to apologize to the audience for the technical difficulties being experienced with the headsets. I am sure that they'll be working on it assiduously so that it will be working in short time to the benefit of all delegates. Moving forward, I now invite members to turn their attentions to the screens to my left and my right as greetings are brought by the member of the Chamber of Deputies, President of the ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality, Ms. Karina Banfi from Argentina.
Estimados colegas, buenos días. Quiero saludar a los delegados y a las delegadas del encuentro en nombre de la Red Parlamentaria por la Igualdad de Género de ParlAmericas.
Network. Good morning, colleagues. Greetings to all gathering delegates on behalf of the ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality. I extend my thanks to the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and to the Honorable Bridget Anisette George, as Speaker of the House of Representatives and host of the gathering in particular. Regarding the topic that brings us together, I think it is necessary to highlight that climate change is not gender neutral. Women, girls, men, and boys experience its impacts and risks in different ways. Women living in poverty experience multiple social, political, and economic barriers and are therefore more likely to also experience the risks and impacts related to climate change that cause natural disasters. To remedy this situation, we must include value and invest in women's participation at the social, economic, and political level. At the local level, women are at the forefront of innovative solutions to construct more resilient societies. We must help to eliminate the barriers to their participation in the design and implementation of solutions. This will generate more effective results, and these results will be aligned with our country's visions for the future of coming generations.
At this point in time, I would like to invite to the podium to bring remarks the Vice President of ParlAmericas, the Honorable Robert Nault from Canada.
Well, good morning to everyone. Madam Speaker of the House of Representatives, Madam President of the Senate, honorable fellow parliamentarians and guests, on behalf of the Board of Directors of ParlAmericas, I'd like to welcome all of you to the 10th gathering of the ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. First, I think it would be appropriate if I introduce myself to you. For those of you who do not know me, I am Bob Nault. My mother calls me Robert. And so don't tell her that everybody else says Bob. My name is Bob Nault, and I'm a member of Parliament of Canada's House of Commons. Have had the great honor of being a member of Parliament for 18 years, and over that period of time I've seen many things from a parliamentarian's perspective, from the inside of Cabinet to the outside of Cabinet, and so I think these kinds of networks are very, very important as parliamentarians for us to get to know not only each other but the issues that we confront and to find best practices, and I think our speaker has made that very clear in her remarks in particular. I'm also have the honor to chair Canada's Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee, and as been mentioned, I'm the Vice President of ParlAmericas and chair of the Canadian section of ParlAmericas. I know that at least some of you were expecting to see ParlAmericas President, Senator Marcelo Guerrera, but at this podium, but there is an election in Mexico, I understand, and a very difficult one at that. And so in a few short months, I'm sure that we'll find that Senator Guerrero will be back in her duties as President with all of us. So she sends her apologies and best wishes to this delegation, and in particular wanted to say hello to the Speaker, who is on our Board of Directors. As we begin this meeting of the Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality, I'd like to extend our gratitude to the following for their hard work in making this gathering possible. So first and foremost, the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, thank you for hosting, and the Honourable Bridget Anisette-George, Speaker of the Trinidad and Tobago House of Representatives, and also a member of our Board of ParlAmericas. And as always, I want to commend the staff of ParlAmericas International Secretariat for all their hard work. Alicia, thank you very much. Since its creation in 2003, the Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality, which was formerly known as the Group of Women's Parliamentarians, has led the gender equality work of ParlAmericas. This annual gathering serves as an important forum to facilitate dialogue and exchange best parliamentary practices on issues of gender equality, women's political empowerment, and inclusive development. Now you might wonder why there are men here in this particular setting, but of course, as we all know, it's gender, and sometimes we forget and the importance of that, and men have to play a very inclusive role in making gender work. And so I'm one of those who very much thinks that if we're going to be successful, we have to be active as men, and so I'm very honored and pleased to be one of your main supporters. We are in Port of Spain to discuss gender responsiveness vis-a-vis climate change and climate action. This global issue requires global thinking and a political commitment from each of us. Rising temperatures and sea levels, an increasing frequency of extreme weather events such as heat waves, droughts, forest fires, and heavy rains, changing precipitation patterns, these are just a few of the manifestations of climate change. They have concrete impacts on people in the Americas and the Caribbean. They affect infrastructure, access to water, food production, human health, livelihoods, and much more. The impacts of climate change are very real and already being felt around the world, albeit to different degrees and in different ways to each of our countries, but these impacts and the threats posed require immediate action. Last year, unfortunately, many of our colleagues from the Caribbean and the Americas experienced severe and frequent natural disasters such as hurricanes and flooding firsthand. many parts of the Caribbean have yet to recover fully from last year's events. Canada is also no stranger to increased frequency and severity of weather events. In recent years, we have experienced severe flooding in several parts of our country, as well as major forest fires that require massive evacuations in Canada's western provinces. In that particular instance, Canada requested support from other countries, including Mexico, the United States, and Australia, to help fight the forest fires because they were that big and needed the help of these other countries. The capacity of countries and people to mitigate climate change and to adapt to its consequences is the result of many factors, including underlying social inequalities. Groups that are traditionally marginalized, such as women or Indigenous peoples, are less likely than men to participate in international or national climate change discussions aimed at designing mitigation and adaptation strategies. Without their perspectives, discussions about how to improve the health and well-being of their countries in the face of climate change are incomplete. Evidence suggests that gender-based stereotypes and behaviors influence both how men and women are affected by climate change and how they react to mitigation and adaptation measures. Since some suggest that climate policies must consider men's and women's different contributions to and perceptions of climate change, as well as the mitigation and adaptation solutions that they perceive to be the most effective for them, and that's what we are here to try and discuss this morning. Some of you here today might be aware of Canada's new feminist international assistance policy. Announced 2 years ago, this policy puts gender equality at the core of Canada's official development assistance. The policy goal is that by 2020, 95% of Canada's bilateral aid should target or integrate gender equality as an objective. As well, under this policy, the Government of Canada committed $2.65 billion to initiatives that address climate change internationally. At present, more than 40 projects around the world are funded, and most of them integrate gender equality in their design. Canada is contributing to a number of initiatives designed to support countries in the Americas and the Caribbean in their effort to address climate change. A few examples are Canada is currently supporting an Inter-American Bank initiative to leverage private sector investments in the clean energy sector in the Americas. Canada is also contributing to natural disaster management projects in the Caribbean, which will improve countries' capacity to plan for and to respond to such events as floods and hurricanes. Additionally, Canada is president of the G7 in 2018, and gender-responsive climate action is a main theme of that presidency. Last week, Canada's Minister of the Environment and Climate Change hosted a high-level summit attended by 70 women from around the world and representing all sectors who are leading global efforts on climate change and women's empowerment. The event contributed to the global momentum behind the gender equality and climate action movements and demonstrated that effective actions requires women's participation. As a parliamentarian, and many of you who are parliamentarians in this room, we all know we have an opportunity. In fact, we have a responsibility to demonstrate leadership on gender-responsive climate action. We will all be doing so in part through our dialogue over the coming days, and I'm really looking forward to getting into those kinds of discussions. Parliamentarians have many points of entry into dialogue about gender-responsive climate actions and can play a pivotal role in influencing the integration of gender analysis into climate change, mitigation, and adaptation strategies. For example, we can encourage the collection of data disaggregated by sex, age, and other categories in order to understand how climate change affects different groups, including women within our nations. We can also urge our respective governments to undertake gender-based analysis of programs, policies, and legislation. As one example of how this might happen, the Government of Canada now requires that new policies, programs, and legislative initiatives submitted for approval include a gender-based analysis plus, also known as GBA plus. The GBA plus tool assesses the way in which groups of people may experience policies, programs, and legislative initiatives differently. The plus in GBA plus represents such identity factors as ethnicity, religion, age, and mental and physical disability. As we discussed during the training session yesterday, this tool can be used to analyze budgeting decisions with the intention of having gender-responsive budgeting. So, in conclusion, I want to state the obvious. In the end, addressing inequalities in our society will benefit everyone. Achieving gender equality and climate resilience is essential for meeting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and our government's other international commitments. Political leadership and consistent participation by groups that are traditionally marginalized, including women, are essential for achieving goals in these areas. As is always the case with ParlAmericas, I know that our exchange will lead to concrete ideas for action that we will take home to our parliaments as we work together in applying a gender lens to our efforts to address climate change. It's all about political leadership. It's the only way we'll ever get to a point of making a major difference. We all, those of us who've been in Parliament for a long time or in Cabinet, understand how the budgetary process works, how finance operates, how they make decisions. But if we're to make those changes, they have to come from the Prime Minister, the President, whatever country you're from, all the way down to the parliamentarians who have to do the legwork. And so I'm looking forward, as the Vice President of ParlAmericas and with my colleagues, in going back home after these meetings here in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm told that if you don't go to Tobago, there's something wrong with you. So, having that knowledge now in hand, we're going to have to come back, my colleagues and I, to go and visit, because that's the place to be, I'm told. So, not to diminish Trinidad, but I'm just told that Tobago is a gorgeous place, so I accept the invitation and look forward to being here sometime soon. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nault, and I can assure you that if you speak to the pilots nicely, they will stop over in Tobago on your way back to Canada. Again, I just want to really thank Mr. Nault and his insightful remarks in relation to the initiatives and successes that Canada has had in relation to the topic that is before us. We definitely look forward to your contributions throughout the sessions as we move forward today and tomorrow. Thank you again. At this point, we're going to move forward to the keynote address on the topic of linking the gender and climate change agendas, brought to us by the co-director of the Women's Environment and Development Network, Ms. Bridget Burns.
I wanted to address any technical issues before starting. Honorable ministers, presiding officers, parliamentarians, and guests, with immense gratitude to the ParlAmerica Network for inviting me and We Do to be here. It's truly an honor. I actually started my career, I would say, many years ago as a research assistant to a member of Parliament in the UK. So I appreciate and know very well and also the importance of the impact that you can have through your political leadership. In the 2016 Parliamentary Climate Change Action Plan, it states that to be credible, effective, and legally enforceable, international agreements must be transposed into national legislation supported by appropriate budget allocation and robust oversight to government performance. This puts parliaments at the heart of the response to climate change. And I could not agree with that statement. And I have to share that recently, I think it was weeks ago, but maybe a few days ago in Bonn at the UN climate negotiations, and also last week at the climate summit that we just heard about, hosted by the Ministry of Environment in Canada, called Women Kicking It on Climate. Everyone I spoke to and everyone I mentioned to that this network was having this meeting at this time on this topic was thrilled, was excited, and said that's exactly what needs to be happening. So clearly, I think we're on the right track in terms of understanding where we are in the political moment and seeing the kinds of training and conversations and dialogues that should be happening. The fact of the matter is, and I'm going to address this in just a bit, the global framework for action on climate change, including but not limited to the Paris Agreement, has firmly recognized that to be effective and truly transformative, climate action must respect and promote gender equality and women's rights. This understanding did not come about overnight, but through many decades of work, of research and advocacy, to articulate to policymakers and practitioners what, at least from we do and my perspective, is common sense legislating and implementation. That climate change is not a problem in and of itself, but a symptom of a growing industrialized society and how it interacts with the earth. Thus, as a human and societal challenge, humans and social issues, including how society is gendered, must be at the heart of how we aim to mitigate and adapt to this challenge. And so before I get into some examples, and I have to say that it's been a real joy to hear all of the incredibly distinguished leaders who presented and opened up the session before me already articulating some of the clear links between gender and climate change in their own context. But I'd like to give you a little bit of information and background about my organization. We're a global women's advocacy organization working for a just world that promotes human rights, gender equality, and the integrity of the environment. And we were founded over 25 years ago at the start of the Earth Summit in the 1990s. And I wanted to, there's many things that we as an organization were attempting to do. We were bringing and ensuring women's leadership as participants in those processes, but also ensuring that women's perspectives and gender equality were included in the outcomes. And Dr. Hazel Brown, who is also here, and I was able to talk to over the break, who's a former NGO coordinator here in Trinidad and Tobago of NGOs working on women's rights, she called We Do the chief troublemakers. And the advocacy and the work that we were doing there was about training and engaging with women's rights activists to making sure that their voices could be heard in those processes. And I share this because often it's thought that this intersection of gender and climate change and environment is a new idea, but for many years and many decades, people have been, and women in particular, have been working at this intersection. And We Do works towards two goals, which I think are actually goals that we all need to hold in our minds as we do work on gender and climate change. The first is that women are empowered to claim their rights as decision makers, advocates, and leaders, especially on issues related to the environment and sustainable development. So there's a numerous amount of projects that we work on. That's, for example, supporting the participation of women from developing countries on their national delegations to the climate negotiations, as well as to working with grassroots or indigenous women to bring them into spaces such as the climate negotiations or perhaps at national or local level where they can voice their concerns about what's happening to them in the context of their own communities. And then the second goal is to ensure that sustainable development policies, plans, and practices are gender responsive, environmentally and socially just, and effectively implemented. And we do that across several different policy spaces, engaging in the Green Climate Fund, in the UN climate negotiations, in the Commission on the Status of Women, in the process to develop the Sustainable Development Goals and all of its follow-up, including also desertification, biodiversity, anywhere that there are discussions at a global level happening about our planet, you can find women's rights and gender experts who are there each day trying to make these linkages and intersections. And part of the strategy that we have for linking social, science, and policy is to create and generate intersectional knowledge. And so I have some examples there. I'm not going to go through them because I'm going to talk a bit more detailed about what the links between gender and climate change are. But just to say that in our experience, we have to and continually need to create more tools and information for policymakers to contextualize this issue to what's happening in their own constituencies and their own communities, and also to link it to the science and data that's being presented at international level. So we have an example there where we took one of the stats from the recent IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their 5th report, and we looked at what they were saying were going to be the impacts of climate change and linked that to what we know about gender and also what kinds of policies and practices different governments are putting in place to address that. And before, again, going into gender and climate change links, this has been reiterated here a lot, and I have to say, I think that the interparliamentary network that you have is really advanced in how you speak about gender, I must say. I think that one of the challenges that we have at an international level is that there's still a lot of misunderstanding. There is often a conflation that gender means women. And so when we're talking about gender, first of all, it's an issue that only women should be concerned about, and it's an issue that only means we're talking about policies and practices that are targeted at women. Now, of course, and this is why I emphasize the 2 goals that we do has, of course, there is a need and a space for policies and programs that are supporting women's rights and their equal right to participate, and that will require certain resources and programs specifically targeting women. But they also must target the gender power imbalances that exist in certain situations, particularly at community levels, and any project, for example, that if you're talking about a forestry project that just targets women without considering the gender power imbalances that might exist in their homes and their households, can actually lead to increased rates of violence in different communities. So having a gender analysis and a gender lens where you're looking at what the impacts are on men and women, but also what the power relationships are in any community, in any context, is critically important. And I mention here that we always must consider gender as only one intersection of multiple intersections, including race, class, sexual orientation, etc. So what are some of these links between gender and climate change? I'm just going to go through a few of the most obvious and hopefully paint a picture of what this looks like. So we know that, you probably won't be able to fully see this slide, but the reason that we share it, and this is part of the discussions that we have with different types of policymakers and activists, that we know in principle from around the world that gender gaps persist and continue to exist, that climate change impacts are going to be felt and are already being felt related to crop failure, fuel shortage, water scarcity, natural disaster, disease, conflict, etc. And that when you put these together, that climate change has the potential to exacerbate gender inequalities if those inequalities are not taken into account in the way that we design programs and policies. That is the basic premise in which we all start from. So if we look, for example, at agriculture, agricultural vulnerability to climate change depends on cropping practices and access to land, as well as farming inputs and tools, water, fertilizer, and other inputs, as well as who adopt sustainable agricultural practices, are more likely to adapt to the impacts of climate change, yet access and knowledge of these tools and practices is gendered. In many settings, women are less likely to possess the knowledge and financial capital needed to improve their farms. Moreover, new technologies that are intended to improve adaptive capacity may not have gender equalizing outcomes. For example, and this relates a lot to the agriculture team that we had yesterday during the gender budgeting session. I think you saw a lot of these things come out. Men and women often plant different types of crops and have different access to livestock. Depending on local context, this can make women or men more vulnerable to the effects of climate shocks. Cropping decisions can be impacted by the ability of women and men to secure the access to capital and agricultural resources. And around the world, women tend to have less access than men to cash and credit. Women are also less likely to have access to tools, seeds, and fertilizers, as well as high-quality water supplies, all of which increase women's vulnerability to the effects of climate change. Studies in Mexico have shown that women who have access to irrigation plant a greater diversity of crops than comparable to men, often making them more resilient to climate shocks. And further, we're seeing as migration flows reduce male involvement in farming in many parts of rural Latin America, women are playing increasingly important roles in maintaining knowledge about different plant varietals, as well as deciding which crops to plant. And we've seen that in Mexico and Bolivia. And I think that particularly for disaster-prone regions, the issue of migration is a really important consideration when you're talking about resilience and gender, because often you see gender dynamics shifting as a result of disasters or as a result of loss of natural resource because of the impacts of climate change. And that can create different gendered power structures than we had before. But it's important to note that often those are temporal. Perhaps that once the situation becomes ameliorated and men come back into the situation, you won't necessarily have seen a complete shift in the leadership and norms of those societies. In terms of water, climate change is reducing the quality and quantity of safe water available around the world, forcing primarily women and girls to walk long distances, and in turn limiting their time for other activities, including education and income generation. The global energy transition of our energy systems to more sustainable forms of production as a means of mitigating the effects of climate change has gendered implications. Women and men face gendered barriers to electricity access, for example, but also who is going to benefit from a transition to a clean energy economy and who might be left at the side. Increasing disasters, we talked a lot about this yesterday. And one of the most comprehensive and widely cited articles exploring the gendered impacts of natural disasters suggests that females are more likely to be killed by natural disasters or systematically killed at younger ages than males. The gender gap in mortality grows as the magnitude of the disaster increases, implying that as climate change breeds stronger droughts and storms, women and girls will be disproportionately affected. But we have seen that the disparity gets reduced. And that gendered social, economic, and political contexts can shape vulnerability. And often, particularly in the developed world, men and boys are more vulnerable to health impacts from climate change-related disasters than women and girls. I have often heard a stat many times that women are 14 times more likely to die in a disaster. I would like to not use that stat anymore because I don't know where it comes from. And I think what's important to note is that gender has to be a context in which we understand and look at disasters. As we heard yesterday, perhaps in your community and your constituency, it might be elderly men who are living alone who are going to be most impacted and therefore most vulnerable after a disaster. And like I said, we saw in many flooding incidents in developed countries, it's actually men who are more likely to die because of the role that they play in first responder systems. But there's also the longer term gendered impacts of disasters, and it's something we have to sit in because of the impacts that climate change are causing. So for example, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in the United States, women's caregiving roles created work-related challenges. Partly as a result of those responsibilities, women were more likely than men to drop out of the labor force after the storm. Women were substantially less likely than men to maintain their pre-hurricane employment or a job of similar status. And moreover, women in New Orleans experienced an average loss of earnings of 7% in the year after the storm, while males experienced a 23% gain, thanks largely to the importance of male-dominated construction and sales fields in the labor market. I'm not going to be able to go too much in depth. I'm going to skip that for a second and go back to it. I forgot, this is an older PowerPoint. Okay, so I wanted to point out that in addition to the research that I was sharing here, which is part of a report that was done in 2016 to create an evidence base of research around the globe on what are the gendered impacts that we know of, that we have peer-reviewed, that we can cite across areas of adaptation strategies, livelihoods, migration, fisheries, forestry, transport, urban livelihood adaptations. In addition to doing that at a global level, we also recently completed that in Canada at a national level. And there were some really interesting stats that came out. So in the area of food security, which is a big issue, particularly in the Northern Territories of Canada, the impacts are gendered. The impacts in terms of what type of gathering or hunting, particularly in Inuit communities, you see women and men doing. In transport, despite driving more on the whole, national data showed that men are more likely than women to ride bikes. Although the disparity is not too huge, it's 47% of men and 34% of women. But interestingly, the study also suggested that women and men use this transport for different reasons. Consumption is a really interesting one. In Canada, meat consumption is heavily gendered. According to the 2015 census, men consumed roughly 70% more fresh red meat per capita and nearly twice as much processed red meat and processed poultry as women, which I think is an interesting and unexpected thing to find. And then also in terms of how do we create this just transition? In Canada, available evidence suggests that many resource management institutions are largely controlled by men, while a majority of the jobs in renewable energy and other environmental services belong to men. So this suggests that without specific interventions, it could be that industry that specifically benefits from a transition to renewable energy. But also it means that men are particularly vulnerable to policy shifts towards a sustainable, more sustainable environmental means of production. And in addition, although only 25% of Canadian environmental professionals are women, though it varies considerably, but in construction, only 13% of environmental professionals are women. So I just share this because, and I'll come to this when we talk about the national policy pieces, but often issues of gender and climate change are seen as issues for developing countries. And again, why it's important to provide a gender lens is that these intersections happen in all countries, including in developed countries, and they frame how we should be designing our policy responses. And now I'm ready to go back to the benefits. So what are the benefits of taking a gendered approach to climate change? So in principle, taking a gender-responsive approach to climate action ensures the promotion of human rights and that the projects and policies don't exacerbate inequalities, but it also enhances the overall effectiveness of the action on sustainable development. The relevance of gender issues are not often well understood by many practitioners involved in climate change mitigation, investments, and financing mechanisms. Prevailing approaches to reducing emissions have prioritized scientific and technological measures, often at the expense of social and behavioral considerations. Most of the mitigation projects and funds so far have supported large-scale energy infrastructure and industrial efficiency programs, often viewed as mitigation projects that must be gender neutral. Public acceptance of these low-emission transitions is critical to energy, transportation, and agriculture sector, and it requires the involvement of a large number of people, including men and women. So integration of gender equality in project implementation can improve their effectiveness and viability. If we look at transport, in Latin America and the Caribbean, over 50% of users of public transportation systems are women. However, not all systems are designed with the needs and perspectives of women in mind. Beyond that, the participation of women in the construction and operation of transport systems does not exceed 15% of the total labor in the sector, even though they represent 50% of the labor force in the region. So there have been a few examples of projects. In Colombia, one of the clean development mechanism projects that they had was the Transmilenio bus service, and they did make some attempts in terms of integrating specifically designed designated seats for women and children to have separate entry doors for pregnant women and other vulnerable riders, and to launch, in partnership with UN Women, a campaign to decrease sexual harassment on crowded buses, and subsequently recommended strategies to enhance women's safety. Because if you have a huge bus system being put in place that is supposed to be promoting sustainable development, you need to take the concerns of riders into account. We've also had some really good examples in forestry in Mexico, where for example, in Oaxaca, funding allowed the community forest enterprise to increase mechanization and supporting training for women in the forest production process, resulting in a tripling of direct employment for women in the sawmills. And similarly, in the Durango Pino Real Forest Corporation, 1/4 of the 80 jobs generated by the project have gone to women, including the director's position. So we've already seen really, and these are just a few of the many examples we've seen where this incorporation has resulted in impacts. And I want to mention quickly that it's not just where these examples come from. We know we have holistic solutions as examples that exist from around the world. There's a website here, the Women, Gender, Climate, Gender Just Solutions, which is something that we've been promoting for the last 3 years now, because often in spaces like the climate negotiations, you only hear about these very large-scale, top-down solutions and not necessarily community-based or local solutions that could be scaled and replicated across many countries and have a very similar impact as some of the larger projects. And so these are just a few that I've highlighted here, from low carbon manufacturing of all natural Caribbean beauty treats, started here in Trinidad and Tobago. So if anyone would like to visit a spa, I have one to recommend that is both employing women as well as taking an ecological approach to how they make their products. But we also have women-led energy-efficient agricultural models, integrated waste management systems that are being promoted and put in place by Mayan indigenous women. There's bike projects in Brazil, which are focused on creating bike collective trainings for women. And there's also solidarity funds being created to support women's access to drinking water. So lots of examples exist. And part of enabling environments for change, I think I've used Mexico as an example before, but for many reasons, there's a strong enabling environment in Mexico for advanced work on gender and climate change because of national policies that exist, but also because of local legislation. So in 2013, WeDo had supported a case study on gender and climate change within Mexico, and the research showed the inclusion of a gender perspective in some institutions and environmental programs in certain states, such as the local environment ministries in Yucatan, Chiapas, Tabasco, and the federal district. Most of them had explicitly acknowledged an interest in integrating a gender approach, or at least in increasing the participation of women in their programs. And in some cases, this trend has had an effect on municipal governments due to the focus on local mechanisms of advancement for women. An example of such local mechanisms can be found in the Diagnostic on Environment and Sustainable Development in the state of Hidalgo, made by the Hidalgo's Institute for Women, who included gender equality, the objective in incorporating gender perspective into the state climate change strategy in their recent program on gender equality. And there's also other promising examples, such as the Veracruz Institute for Women, where several courses offer training for public officers at municipal level on topics such as gender. And so to quickly move into what all of this means from a global process space, we have several critically important global processes that were decided in 2015, which really frame the action that we are taking on climate change today. Those include the Paris Agreement. They also include the Sustainable Development Goals, and they include the Sendai Framework for Disaster Resilience. But there are many others beyond that. There's multiple multilateral environmental agreements. There's also, I have a picture of Hawaii there because in 2016 there was a conservation congress where they were coming up with what the 30-year agenda for conservation would look like. And part of, I think, the important work that we do is trying to translate and transpose what all of this means at a national level. And as I said earlier, the mandate for gender-responsive climate action is integrated across all of those frameworks. In the Paris Agreement, we have one of the key principles of the Paris Agreement was that parties and state governments needed to take gender equality and the empowerment of women into account in the starting preamble of of the decision of the Paris Agreement. There was also integration of gender language within adaptation, that all adaptation had to be gender responsive, and that capacity building had to be gender responsive. And interestingly, beyond this, we know the Paris Agreement is made up of countries' nationally determined contributions. The success of the Paris Agreement lies in countries implementing these contributions. And so 64 out of the 190 intended nationally determined contributions that we had for the Paris Agreement included references to women or gender. 13 are from the Americas: Barbados, Brazil, Costa Rica, Dominica, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So if you didn't hear your name, then it's important to look at what your NDC is and perhaps how that process will include gender and climate change, gender and human rights, I should say. And interestingly, you might note the 64 out of the 190 are only developing countries. Not a single developed country included gender or human rights in their NDC, which again goes to show why we need to understand gender as a lens and not as a development issue. I also, before moving on to the Gender Action Plan, want to say what I added before. Every single climate finance mechanism that exists, so the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, the Adaptation Fund, all of them have gender plans of action and gender policies, which means that every accredited entity that wants to become part of the Green Climate Fund has to have a gender plan of action. And every project that gets put forward to the Green Climate Fund has to have a gender analysis and a gender component. So this has become a critical view and lens for how we get money for gender action. And excitingly, at the COP last year, parties adopted a gender action plan, because in addition to having this in the Paris Agreement, there are over 65 decisions of the climate, under the climate negotiations that include and call for the integration of gender and the empowerment of women. But what parties were understanding and seeing is that there was a real struggle to move from the words to action. And in a post-Paris world where we need to be focused on implementation, what can be done to actually ensure we're moving on the gender mandates that we've given ourselves at a national level? And so the Gender Action Plan was adopted. It's a 2-year work plan. It includes themes around capacity building, gender balance, coherence, gender responsive implementation, and monitoring and reporting. And I wanted to point out one in particular, which is that it specifically called for an action and activities to strengthen the capacity of gender mechanisms, including for parliamentarians, the International Parliamentary Union, commissions, funding ministries, non-governmental organizations, for the integration of gender-responsive budgeting into climate finance, access delivery, etc. This was something that was discussed over numerous consultations. It was identified by activists and policymakers that engagement with parliamentarians, with gender machineries on the issues of gender-responsive budgeting was critical and important to actually integrating the Gender Action Plan. And so again, this is why this meeting is so timely and so important. And so how are countries acting on the Gender Action Plan? Countries are supporting implementation via direct support for trainings, enhancing women's participation. I consider this meeting here acting on the Gender Action Plan because it is starting to put that knowledge and dialogue together. Countries are transposing or linking their own national strategies on gender and climate change to those activities of the GAP. Sudan has created a national gender and climate change strategy, and they have already started to link to those different aspects of the Gender Action Plan. Countries are developing tools to integrate gender into their nationally determined contributions. Countries are appointing national gender and climate change focal points and national task force. There's currently 22 nominated gender and national climate change focal points. But again, this is about how do we institutionalize this at a government and ministerial level to be able to support national implementation. And then, of course, organizations, local governments, and others are creating their own self-assessments of what are we doing in my constituency, in my community, in my organization to support action on the Gender Action Plan. So the final thoughts I want to leave you with are that successful implementation of the Paris Agreement, but more than the Paris Agreement, successful implementation of climate action is in our hands now. It is in your hands specifically. It is in the hands of civil society, of local businesses, of those who are actually going to put their words into action. Tools for integrating gender into your budgets, into your policies are readily available. We saw from the training yesterday that there are case studies and ways that we can really make sure that this is integrated. But subnational solutions must be implemented, monitored, and fed back into global processes to show that we are actually making progress on this. So I really invite all of you, if you in your own constituencies are taking this on, if you are doing an activity to create a more gender responsive budget, if you're doing an activity to create more gender responsive legislation related to climate change, then be in contact with those international policy spaces. Be there, be present, and showcase how this is happening. Form unique partnerships with local women-led community groups, CSOs, and larger entities, and support them in promoting cooperative models around multiple industries. And finally, and this was already said, but do what you can to ensure the collection of sex and gender disaggregated data, particularly looking at sectors that will need to shift to combat climate change. Whether it's your fossil fuel-based economy, transport, agricultural, forestry, the time is now to look at those sectors that we know need to shift, see where women and men are, and ensure in that transition that it's a just transition and that we don't recreate a clean, low-carbon society where women and men are still so unequal in terms of the labor force, in terms of access to resource and access to benefits. So with that, I'm going to leave you with those final thoughts. I have a number of additional resources that I've shared. And again, it's an immense honor to be here with you today. I go back to what I said in the beginning. I really, really think that the power for implementing effective gender-responsive climate action is at subnational local level, is with you, and it is about your leadership on these issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you again, Ms. Burns, for your presentation today, which has provided a very strong foundation for the discussions to come. I think that it has also, and more importantly, armed each and every individual here today with the knowledge to be able to return to the respective countries and continue the conversation on a topic that to many might have seemed as though they don't go together, but after that presentation, as well as the presentations that have come before you in terms of remarks, shows that they definitely do go together, and urgently so. So again, thank you for that presentation. And that brings us to the end this morning of the remarks and the presentations that we've had scheduled. So now I invite to the podium the President of the Senate of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, to bring vote of thanks.
The Honourable Bridget Anisette George, Member of Parliament, Speaker of the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honourable Camille Robinson Regis, MP, Minister of Planning and Development, the Honourable Ayanna Webster Roy, MP, Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister, the Honorable Robert Nolt, Vice President of ParlAmericas, Senator the Honorable Mubida Jaffer, Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Network on Gender Equality, Ms. Bridget Burns, Co-Director, Women's Environment and Development Network, and our feature speaker, other government ministers and members of Parliament of the various jurisdictions, members of the Diplomatic Corps and international organizations, Dr. Denise Sawyerfat Angus, Presiding Officer of the Tobago House of Assembly, Secretaries and Assemblymen of the Tobago House of Assembly, mayors and representatives of the municipal corporations, senior government officials, representatives of non-governmental civil society organizations and community-based organizations, representatives of ParlAmericas, specialist observers and assistants, the Executive Director of ParlAmericas and staff, the Clerk of the House and staff of the Office of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. May I assure you that that is the longest part of my speech today. We have arrived at the end of our opening ceremony, and mine is now the extremely pleasant duty of saying thanks to all of those who made all of this possible. Let me start by expressing profound gratitude to all of our speakers this morning, who, may I say, have set exactly the right tone for the next few days of discussion on the very important and relevant theme of gender-responsive climate action. They have taught us a great deal today, and we are very much indebted to each of them. Let me also thank ParlAmericas for partnering with the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago in putting on this event, and for providing an ideal platform to share and exchange best practices and to access the specialized resources and support required to strengthen efforts to advance gender-sensitive policies and legislative action among parliaments in the region. An event of this magnitude involving so many countries requires immense planning and preparation. We therefore say thanks to all of the hard-working and dedicated staff of ParlAmericas and of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago for collaborating so effectively and for managing so efficiently all the operational and logistical elements of today's proceedings. You have done so with ineffable style and grace. And may I just add, when I speak of the Parliament staff, I must single out our wonderful choir, who had, Madam Speaker, and my hearts bursting with pride when they gave that beautiful rendition of our national anthem. Thank you to all of the delegates from our Parliament and beyond for demonstrating such an interest in this event, and thank you to all the NGOs and CBOs in attendance today for gracing us with your presence and for your advocacy in general. Thank you finally to everyone whose unsung contribution to this event will pass in silence. Forgive us for not specifically expressing our gratitude to you. The fault, if any, is with us. Please know and believe that your efforts are valued beyond measure. I am supremely confident that after this conference, not only will each of us leave with a sharpened awareness of the need for gender-sensitive policies and legislative action among parliaments in the region, but that we will leave the conference having formed lasting bonds with fellow parliamentarians. And that, to me, is a thing to be thankful for most of all. Thank you once again. Muchas gracias. Merci beaucoup.
Microphone check. 1, 2. Testing. 1, 2.